Hi, everybody. This is Mother of Pearl by Natalie Westbrook, and we actually have Natalie Westbrook here to kind of talk us through the show. And we kind of wanted to record this interview, so to speak, because we felt that some of the work in the show really needed a bit of extra behind the scenes stories that were very fun to hear, and we wanted to share that with you. What we're going to do is we're going to go through some videos and then talk about two specific works as we feel that those kind of capture some of the themes that are in the show. So with no further ado, I'm Bart Keijsers Koning, owner of Keijsers Koning Gallery here in Dallas, Texas. And we have Natalie Westbrook here, who is an artist living currently in Pittsburgh. Natalie, if you want to say hi.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Great, Natalie, we're just going to walk through. We're going to do this video. We have a shared screen here. So this is the show Mother of Pearl, as mentioned, and I just really love the rhythm of this show. It was just something that both Natalie and I had worked on for quite some time. We were acquainted with each other's work, of course, and had talked about it, but one of the new introductions were the sculptures. And that's something that I do want to discuss a little bit. Because that is not just a new element. I think it also brings out the component of the world that Natalie is able to create, and the psychological aspect of it. And it came through a conversation that we were having, that in Natalie's work, there's this kind of third dimension. She kind of accesses it through these trompe-l'oeil effects. And I feel that it's almost like this third world that's kind of looking glass within the work. And that led me to ask her if she'd ever experimented with sculpture. And she hadn't, at least not in public, correct? Or
Right, yeah, I had made some sculptures before, but never really shown them publicly. And I had not worked with gypsum, which is the main material for the sculptures in this show.
Yeah, and I just felt that when we introduced them to the show, it really added this whole nother component. We wanted it to be playful. That's where you can see also in the video, which let me just replay this one section. What I really liked about when we come in is this aspect here, this kind of tiered level cake that's coming in, but it makes for the audience to kind of go stand up or crouch down to kind of confront these little beings that are in the show, and they just offer this really interesting, almost like a room that you're in. That's I enjoyed kind of experimenting with that. Also, when when you walk in, this kind of creates this barrier where, as a viewer, you kind of feel safe and you allow yourself to kind of enter into this other worldliness.
What you were saying reminded me of the feeling of being in the space and within the gallery, of sort of experiencing one of the sculptures, and then sort of from different vantage points catching a bit of a painting as a sort of backdrop behind the sculpture that sort of expands upon that idea of the world within the painting sort of leaping forward or into another dimension.
Did you find that this sculpture, especially this one, I always thought was so funny that you mentioned that there's these old men climbing on top of one another, or a piggyback ride, and you'd mentioned that you didn't start it out as that you're going to make these two old men, but was that similar in your paintings as well, that you kind of have these happenstance moments, or is there a certain amount of planning that's different from your paintings, or is it a similar process?
It's a similar process between the paintings and the sculpture, and that there's little planning involved. There's some sort of the gist of an idea, it's usually very visual, the idea. Then I feel like my job in a way is to go to the studio and find ways to sort of surprise myself. And that's what keeps me engaged. And I feel like if I can kind of predict or plan everything that's going to happen or unfold, then the work is sort of dead to me in a certain way. Whereas when I'm sort of caught off guard by what happens in the process, it's a lot more engaging for me, and it allows for a certain energy or life to kind of exist within the work. I hope, for the viewer's experience as well, because I make things that I want to see and experience for myself, but I also am making them, with the idea of other people to encounter them. But with this sculpture, this was the first of all the sculptures that I made. I entered sculpture this last year with the idea of making objects in 3 dimensions as painting references, not as standalone sculptures that I would exhibit. And this was my first idea, was that I had been painting faces and stacked heads, kind of motif of figures that were stacked based on a drawing my daughter made of me giving her a piggyback ride. She made when she was about 5 or 6, and I thought I wanted to expand upon that imagery and show more of full bodies within a painting. And I thought, well, I'd like to have a bit of a reference. I don't want to necessarily adhere to, strictly to proper anatomy or something like that, but I just wanted to kind of think about, like, how does a hand sort of wrap around a head or hold on to shoulders, or how does someone slump over? And I didn't want to refer to photographs necessarily. I wanted something to kind of like abstract the imagery by way of process. So I thought, well, I'll make some sort of a painterly sculptural version of this image, and then I'll paint from that. And clay was a thought in my mind because it's so painterly. You can sort of see your thumbprints, in the material of clay. But the idea of firing clay, sort of glazing, was sort of like too slow of a process. There's something very immediate in the way that I like to paint and work with the material of paint on a surface, and I wanted that immediacy in the sculpture material as well. And so that's how I arrived at sort of making a very quick wire armature, and then using gypsum as this material that is very wet and painterly and sloppy, but only for a matter of minutes, and then it dries hard. And yes, you can sand it and shape it and so forth, but I wanted to kind of work with it with its limitations as this sort of goopy organic material as it is, and sort of see how far I could push it in that way. And I became so enamored with the magic of that process that I started to conceive of these as actual sculptural objects standing on their own, rather than using them as references for paintings. So I ended up not working from these as painting references whatsoever. And to answer your specific question about the 2 men who are in a piggyback ride, I initially wanted, these 2 stacked figures, but just in the same way that my paintings show stacked figures that aren't necessarily, while they're inspired by my daughter's drawing of herself and me, they're not at all biographical or autobiographical. They're not at all personal in that way. They're meant to sort of open up to a more universal idea of like any 2 figures, any 2 relationship between yourself and your psyche, or 2 doppelgangers, or twins, or familial relationship. Any of these sort of ideas of the relationship between 2 beings. And so with the piggyback ride, I didn't want to make something super saccharine that was like a small figure, a child on top of an adult. And so I aimed to make these 2 figures sort of both similar in scale and size. And when I went to paint the figures, it just happened to appear the way that the gypsum had formed around the head looked like kind of a receding hairline. And I started to suddenly perceive these 2 figures I had made as elderly men. And I thought, well, what if they're both elderly men, and like they're both holding each other up? And it became very poetic for me in this way, especially having, first thought of this idea of the piggyback ride in terms of a child and an adult. And a friend of mine, an artist friend of mine, brought to my attention after the show opened the story of Aeneid by Virgil, and the one of the many stories comprised within is this scene of Aeneas carrying his father on his back, his elderly father, out of the burning city, and it's this imagery that's been depicted through painting and sculpture for centuries. And so I kind of love that connection, and as it relates to ideas about youth and age and that kind of relationship, and maybe the notion that you carry the burden of age by way of youth, and then in order to move forward you have to set that down and kind of relinquish it. So it was interesting to think of some of that sort of in retrospect.
I mean, we spoke about that quite a bit, especially about the idea of age and youth, and also the terms that are usually used. And what I appreciate about your work so much is that it's this kind of freeing aspect to it. I mean, you've spoken quite a few things in there that I want to enhance on, but one of those freeing aspects is that idea of how structure is translated, how, by your daughter's drawing. And I think that's in general, when a kid draws, there's a certain moment of freedom there, just as, because I always said, it took me years to unlearn what I've learned and become a child, be inspired again like a child. And I think that type of logic of a child is very fascinating. It's something that we tend to lose, which is kind of unfortunate. Because yes, it can be a sense of stacking, it can be a sense of closeness, it can be a sense of building, it can be a sense of a totem, and why not kind of have these people stacked and allow for this subconscious ideas to kind of come forth, like what we see here in the sculpture of age, supporting age. I mean, we all kind of deal with that in a certain sense, if it's not our own aging, is of those around us, and the responsibility where, you become a parent, but at the same time you become a parent, and even if you're not a parent, you're dealing with your parents, and you also become the caretaker. It's that fluidity of life that we all have to get accustomed to. And I think that's always very brave of how you approach your work, and interesting also that you approach it not just in subject matter, but also through your materials. I mean, while you were speaking, I kind of went through that other video of the other head because of the fluidity, and that the gypsum really shows, let me just go there again, that movement that's so tricky, especially technically speaking. But we see here, this great moments where the nose and this eye, this head kind of appears and could disappear at any second, but it's there for us to see, enjoy, encounter. Plus you use spray paint, which kind of gives this very soft feeling to it, even though it's very flat and cold. So it's all these kind of contrasting points that kind of come through, but I think, I mean, we were from this kind of technical aspect and kind of discussing materials, we were going to go to the font, but I think actually it's more interesting to kind of go to lookalike, because we hit on a few things that I think, be silly to skip over and kind of reference ourselves back. But just here we have, clear up these for 1 second. So this is Lookalike, which is a painting that is oil and acrylic on canvas. It's 84 by 72 inches, so it's quite large. It's actually here in the exhibit room, of course, which I'll show as such. And what's interesting, this is a painting that initially started out with a picture of you and your daughter, and what struck me so much, you struggled with it quite a bit, you told me. And in that struggle, or at least the way you translated it, what I found so interesting as well was the how concerned you are with the viewer, how much you care about what the viewer sees and experiences, which I think translates to the painting. You know, but starting out from something extremely personal and then kind of pulling away at it, that it doesn't become some diary, you know, entry or kind of self narcissistic feeling of obsession, but you kind of just pull at it and push at it and make it something that the viewer can engage with. And you don't need to know this type of relationship as far as a mother-daughter, but you do, there may be something that you can relate to in your own life, that you get that feeling of these faces that are literally squished together, almost mushing out of one another. And I love this kind of black line that kind of separates the two faces so bluntly. It's like a carving almost, or, you know, a hatchet that kind of like cuts in between, that there will be separation eventually. But you mentioned that you still struggled with this painting, even looking at it and being done with it. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more, or would you like to?
Yeah, yeah, it's funny to think about this one. Uh, because well, I think I enjoy being a very private person. And so, you know, my work is never, you know, autobiographical or, you know, personal on the surface. You know, I'm not telling stories of my inner life. And yet the work, like I think all artists' work, it comes from within, it's inevitable. And so, this painting, you know, I had been working with this motif of two heads and the relationship between the two, and I had started to work from some photographic images to try to play with how specific can I get and yet maintain the sense of universality for the viewer, that this isn't this isn't portraiture. These are faces, you know, almost like masks. You know, I've been thinking a lot about the history of like death masks and how they've been used like in like Egyptian art and so forth. And you know, the wearing of the masks in the pandemic has been something on my mind as well. But you know, what is visible, what is not visible, and I'm kind of using these sort of illusion of a cutout eye shape, you know, to kind of allude to that sense of a mask. But so with the idea of a mask, there's a bit of like a possibility for multiple identities present. So yes, this started from a very personal place in that you know, I was looking at a photo of myself with my daughter. In fact, she's a baby in the photo. And we look absolutely maniacal. You know, it's like de Kooning's Women or something, like we're just smiling like these garish smiles because we're just having this moment of mother and daughter. And we do have our faces pressed together, and it's, you know, a selfie up close and all that. And so I thought, well, there's some intensity here that's like almost kind of garish in how like jubilant it is in our expressions. And like, how can, you know, what can I do with that is something more universal for other people to kind of relate to? And I thought, well, the first thing I need to do is, you know, work from this pose or this posture, and this engagement of the eyes to the camera. But I don't want to paint a baby, because that's too specifically, you know, adult and young child. And so I thought I'll try to make them look maybe like they could be closer in age, like it's kind of more where it opens it up for more possible reads than simply adult and child. So it sort of evolved from there. And then the painting, that's sort of like all that I set out to do initially. And then I became very involved with like the material. Like you said, I use spray paint on the sculptures, and spray paint is in a lot of the works on canvas as well, because it's sort of a ghost-like kind of a mark. That's sort of neither here nor there. It's sort of like drawing, you know, through particles in the air. And I'm like really enamored by that presence of color and mark, and then how drawing with an oil bar, an oil stick, or with the brush can sort of work in contrast to that. And so I like how this spray paint sort of defies any sense of like a flat surface, because the paint just sort of exists in the atmosphere, it feels. But then as soon as you take a brush or a line with an oil bar, it's very much a mark on a two-dimensional surface. And so I really like that kind of dialogue that happens with the paint. But as it unfolded in this kind of color palette that just was very intuitive, I felt the painting was just really, really hideous. And I had to set it aside for a while. I was like, what have I done? Not only is it hideous, but it's too personal. You know, it's like it comes from this very specific place about me and my daughter. And I felt like I was wearing my heart on my sleeve in a way. So I put it away for a while, but then I came back and worked on it more and more, and it became a lot more to do with the mark making and the gesture and the surface and the way that the material engages with the imagery. And I felt like I finally pushed it to this place where it's no longer myself and my daughter, at all. And it's in this very peculiar place that, like I said earlier, like I like to surprise myself, and I certainly did surprise myself with this one, to the point where at one point it was my least favorite work. I felt embarrassed at the prospect of showing it. And at this point, seeing it within the show, it might be one of my favorites.
Yeah, I mean, I always find it so funny the way you talk about this work, because you're like, you always say it's like I don't paint personally, and there's like this barrier in between whereas when I look at your work, I think it's the most, open work that you can make. It's this absolute honest truth, and there's this, you see you. There's no hiding. So I find it always funny that you're like, oh no, that's not me. And there's this distance when whereas for the viewer, it's this absolute inner world, which is, I think, what's partially so attractive and scary at the same time. It's this like, oh my God, she's bared everything on this canvas, and here I am standing looking at it. So I always find it funny that you kind of push and pull yourself to say like, oh, that's not me, yet there is this wholeness of you on this canvas. And I think the material, again, you make such interesting use of it. Spray paint it's viewers might not be able to see it in these particular images, but it's very flat. And then the oil is kind of what warms it up and gives it a third dimension. It gives it a three-dimensionality, kind of your play with chiaroscuro. I mean, you have a full understanding of painting, and at the same time, there's these points where it can be utter chaos. And I love that tension. You always walk these very fine lines between aesthetic and pain and garish and amazing, lovely colors. I always tell people to hold on to the eyes if they get lost, or if they can't find anything. And that's particularly in these two, I find that so giving. There's a certain element of sadness in in the figure on the left, and then there's this absolute open trust in the figure on the right. And I mean, this is a discussion we also had when we were installing, where I find your approach and your views of youth very interesting, in the sense that you approach it not ideologically or in this kind of praised way that we normally talk about youth and growing and so forth, and especially in this culture. It's everything's innocent, everything's sweet. And I think with your work, you kind of dissect it, saying like, okay, we give them these huge bricks of emotions that have never been defined to these children, and we go figure it out. And kind of the way we scratch at it, we pull at it, that's what makes us who we are, and our scars and everything, what we go from there. And I think you looking back at that is in and through painting is so absolutely fascinating and so revealing and frightening as well for a viewer to kind of see that somebody's able to thrust themselves, because it kind of allows the viewer to say, well, if she can do it, I can do it. That trust of like leaping forth and questioning certain rules that determine our life and the way we look at things. And you just turn it upside down, and you still work with representation, abstraction. It's you kind of take all these elements from these plates and put them together on a canvas in a very composed way, while at the same time you're like chef in a kitchen where everything's blustering around and then some magic happens. Yeah, I found this painting to be utterly magical in the sense of everything that you were able to kind of pull and push at it, and you feel as a viewer, you know, that and when you're in the presence of this painting that it there's certain things that are still unresolved, and I love that, and I love that bravery. Like I always like that when people have certain elements that they just, this is as much as they know right now, and maybe we'll never know more, but like allowing yourself to go there, leaving that question hanging, it allows us as viewers to kind of again look at ourselves and just be like, oh, we can go this far and still are be left with questions and see where we can go. I think what's also interesting in this work is your ability and understanding of painting in and of itself. I can't describe that, you know, or point to it any more than when you stand in front of these. These are paintings up and top. There's a full understanding of how you use a brush, how you use material. You're really a painter's painter, and it's such a treat to stand in front of them in that sense. I also, what I did find very interesting in your, you know, us talking about your work is your inspiration of, you know, 16th, 17th century paintings, which, I mean, we talked about it. Of course, I'd read it in the press release, but, you know, sometimes you're like, oh, that's a reference. Yeah, sure. But when you're surrounded by them and having spent more and more time with these paintings, and also having been able to visit a few museums with you to see how you look at work, and especially, you know, Fragonard and all those painters, which you wouldn't necessarily think of when you see these works, but you once you kind of allow yourself to not sit and stare at rules and just look at what's being painted, what's being done, it makes total sense. And with that, I want to just go over and show the Monster of Monsters, of course, the largest painting I think you've done. It's 112 by 142 inches. You can see it behind me. It looks like a stamp, but trust me, it's not. This thing is huge. And just to show you here as a figure, it's me, but kind of walking past it, just kind of give a sense of size. So, Natalie, would you like to talk a little bit about the inspiration, where it stemmed from? You clearly have had an obsession with Rubens for quite some time, and specifically this painting. You've done a couple of iterations. How many have you done of these?
Too many to count.
Too many. And they've always been large, right? They've never been smaller studies.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So it's inspired by Rubens, the painting The Hippopotamus and a Crocodile Hunt. And I guess why don't you take it away? I mean, I can describe it, but I think you can do, you know, it's a treat to hear you speak about it.
Well, thank you. And thanks for your remarks about the painting lookalike. I appreciate those insights. And I love what you said about the idea of magic. And because I think about that a lot in terms of, you know, my job, like the job I go to in the studio is like this room where I'm sort of manifesting like my visions or my impulses more like, because the visions aren't always very clear. So it's like I don't even know exactly what it is I'm manifesting until there it is. And I experienced that on a completely new level by way of making sculpture. And so I feel like in a way that experience of surprising myself as the artist is a bit of where that magic kind of happens. And that's, I guess, what I'm hopeful to kind of share with the viewership as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And I feel like Rubens is a painter I've always admired for the sense of magic in his world. Specifically, you know, he's very much known for and praised in his depictions of flesh and the sort of tactile sensibility with oil paint and color and texture that he achieves. with that. But and while I admire that very much, because obviously I'm very engaged with texture in all of my work, I've always been particularly enamored with his hunting scenes, and there are only so many of them. When I was in school at Cooper Union, I had the pleasure of going to the Met every Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. was art history class. We would meet at the Met. It was really kind of a special time. And there's a big fox hunt painting of Rubens that, you have to kind of crane your neck to look up and encounter the whole thing. I think what I've always enjoyed about the hunting scenes is the sense of movement. It's of the Baroque period when there's so much sort of dynamic motion. And I growing up, I wished that I had the talent to study dance and be a dancer. I did study it a bit, and ballet and jazz, and I watched a lot of modern dance and performances and so forth. So there's a bit of like dance involved in a work like this, where the gesture isn't just coming from the hand or the arm or the wrist. It's sort of like the whole body gets involved in this kind of gesture that's almost like more akin to modernist painting, like Jackson Pollock or something, dripping on the floor. The hunting scenes, well, really the whole genre of history painting, I've always sort of enjoyed the humorous fact that those paintings, they do depict stories, often biblical stories or myths and characters and scenes, but somehow it's called the genre of history painting, yet not at all depicting anything historical or factual, right? And so I've sort of taken the hippopotamus and crocodile composition of Rubens, has this gaping open mouth of a hippo in the center, and a crocodile that I don't even think lived in the same. Those two animals didn't even mingle together within the same environment or location.
No cohabitation. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's known that Rubens worked from a taxidermied hippo mouth in a museum that he had access to, but it was like the body wasn't really there, and so he sort of avoided drawing the body. The body in his composition sort of like dissolves behind some things in this really peculiar way, and so it's sort of like a disembodied head. And so mine is sort of like amplifying that notion, and I just love this sort of idea of a central mouth that serves as like a portal. And there's almost kind of like a female anatomy here, where this sort of portal space, central in the chaos, serves as sort of like an escape hatch. That there's a lot of chaos, as you were describing earlier in the work, a lot of movement that comes sort of from dance. The chaos of
I mean, it's very elegant, and when I say chaos, I should define it better, because I don't mean it as that it's haphazard in any way. There's very much a rhythm to it. It's just it's like a wall of sound, like that full on breath of everything coming at you. Yeah. And as a viewer, it's lovely that it's so overwhelming, and you do hold on to it. And like you said, you go to the central figure, you go to the mouse, and you fall into this mouse, and you're like, oh shit, where am I? It's like this actually a place you don't want to be, inside of the hippopotamus mouse. You actually are safer somewhere else. But I love the elegance of it as well, which is, maybe not a word that you would think of initially, but I mean, just the way you paint, for example, the horse's ass and the tail, it's just really funny. It's super elegant, and the image of Rubens itself is also, as you mentioned, very operatic or almost like a ballet performance. And I never looked at it as such, which is kind of a fun thing to kind of revisit and see again. But it's an absolute pleasure to see this work in person. Of course, it's beyond overwhelming in a good way. But on that note, I just wanted to kind of close up the conversation. And I think we've touched on a couple of things that are very interesting to kind of talk about in your work, and we could keep going for a while. But the best thing is always to come to the show. It's going to be open until November 19th of 2022. And of course, we have images on our website as well, and we'll show more images in conjunction with this video. But Natalie, I just really want to thank you that you spoke so great about your work and give us such insight to it. I think it's a great way to learn about it and get a little bit more sense of where you're coming from.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity and for your insights as well. Appreciate it.
All right. With no further ado, we'll say bye.